Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm trying to get some confidence back with making videos, so in this video we're going to do an improv session, but we're going to make a procedural material. I don't know what we're going to end up with, but whatever we do end up with, I'm going to put it on Gumroad so you can download it as well. So hopefully this will just turn into like a nice kind of process discussion. Maybe you'll learn some things and we can all just end up with something nice to play with at the end. So yeah, and it won't be like a completely beginner tutorial because I'm going to end up using some of my like pre-made node groups. Some of these are freely available. We can talk through that as well. But yeah, I hope you're doing well and let's play around. So I have been doing some work behind the scenes recently on like other kind of material packs and material content. And in the process of working on these packs, I've kind of come up with like a new lighting setup. What I mean is like a kind of default scene here where I kind of like visualize how materials look on certain objects. In previous packs that I've done for things like modular metals, I always had like a template scene with a template object to kind of visualize the procedural materials as I'm making them, but I wasn't always completely happy with the lighting. So I've kind of put this new scene together, which I am much more happy about lighting wise, and also placed a few objects in it which I think are kind of good for visualizing procedural materials because they have an interesting variety of shapes, like hard surface edges and corners, some with some more curvature, and then other much more organic shapes. This particular object is available on Sketchfab. It's the sculpture bust of Rosa Lowenfeld, which I've probably pronounced wrong, from the virtual museums of Malopolska. And you can get that on Sketchfab. It's a CC0 object because they put some of their scans available for people to download. But since it's CC0, I might include it in the Gumroad download of whatever we end up with in the end. But I will, of course, leave the credit link there. Highly recommend you check out the other objects they have on Sketchfab. But anyway, I was speaking to Ben the other day, kind of like testing different material backgrounds, right? So this is what you'd call a light catcher or a shadow catcher, depending on what you're doing. This object that goes behind the subject that kind of catches the light and all the shadows. There's a bit of contention behind those terms because like shadow catchers don't always have to be opaque. They can just be like a transparent plane that just shows shadows. Anyway, semantics. And I was talking to Ben about, okay, what looks better? Is it a brighter background or a darker background, right? And we kind of figured that a darker background is better because it's not bouncing too much light back onto the subject. So if you're going to be making procedural materials and you have a subject like this, consider going for like a kind of darker, contrasty background so you're not kind of like re-injecting light back into it if you're using cycles. And just for you to take a look at the lighting setup, I have quite a strong light coming from above here, which is giving that kind of, you know, top lighting on the hair. And then we have a couple of angled ones, but they're getting kind of progressively closer to the front. But there's nothing coming directly on the front or on the right side. So we're kind of getting like these nice shadowy areas over the crevices. And you can see what happens as we enable and disable these. I think altogether they make quite a nice lighting setup. Okay, so one of the packs I've been working on recently, I'm not really supposed to tell you about it, but I'll tell you anyway, is like a procedural sculpt material pack, right? So it's a pack of materials that if you're a sculpting artist and you want to just slap something onto a new sculpt to make it look good, I wanted to do like a variety of materials for that. Now, there is a curse, right? Every time I talk about a project I'm working on, it never gets finished. And we have spoken about that kind of psychological quirk on this channel before. It's a very common thing that if you talk about what you're doing before you finish it, you probably won't finish it or you won't stick with it if it's a new skill. But I figure we'll try doing something a bit, you know, along those lines today. Something that if you just finished making a sculpture of some kind, you can just slap it on and it will just look good in any situation. So I have a material applied to it. It's called default matte. Let's take a look at the values. Metallic at 0. Metallic, you generally want to keep at one of the flat numbers, so 0 or 1. I think for today we'll keep it on 0. I generally like to think about it as like plastic to metal, but it's probably a bit more complicated than that. The roughness value here is of course like your reflectivity. So if we put that down to 0, we can imagine that because the metallic's on 0, we have a completely reflective plastic material. And that is kind of what it looks like. It's like something's being like vacuum formed. And then of course, if I turn the metallic back up, now we have like a completely reflective metallic material and we can play with the roughness for that. The other options we probably won't touch too much, like the clear coat and the sheen. You can play around with those. You kind of get like a bit of a Fresnel effect, but that won't be too concerning for us. I think today we're going to focus on the color, roughness, and normal, because these are the ones that kind of go the furthest, I suppose, when it comes to like PBR materials and specular really, but we can play with that. All right, so the first thing I do when making materials is I kind of think about like the physicality aspect, as in trying to get as much information about the shape as possible. If you watched any of my other tutorials, you know that I always bring out the ambient occlusion like it's like the first thing I ever do, because it's our first point of action for describing the shape of an object. So let's visualize that. We probably won't end up using this node specifically because I have another one. But if I take the ambient occlusion node, plug it into a color ramp and plug that into the color, not the subsurf. Now, if we play with the ramps, right, we can see that it's describing the shape is what it's doing. We're essentially taking this color ramp and then getting a gradient based on the curvature. It's not really curvature, okay? Before any armchair experts go, it's not the curvature. It's kind of like proximity to other geometry, how things kind of occlude, so get in the way of something else. But it gives us an approximation of the curvature of the object. And because this is plugged into the color and the color ramp is bringing us color data, you you can throw in other handles here and start recoloring them. And what it essentially means is you can get like a multicolored gradient based on the kind of curvature. So if you are just looking for something immediately stylized, here's a little tip for you. You can do that. Like you can just start getting weird and creative with it. And let's leave the black kind of dark there. I suppose let's just, do something like this. So like if you wanted to do like a multicolored paint kind of style thing, then you can do that. And this isn't necessarily the direction that I want to take this tutorial, but you know what, maybe let's play with it a bit. Let me stretch this out on the gradient a bit more, and maybe I'll make that paler. I think like the upper layers of things should kind of be pale if we're doing something kind of like pastel painty. Okay, so if I was making a material out of this, which is quite unlike anything I've done before, then I think, okay, what's the next step? I want to kind of noisify the paint a bit so it looks a bit more splotchy. Maybe if I took like some of the pinks and splattered them on some of the blues. Okay, that's just an idea. We'll need to recycle this color. And secondly, if this is like some kind of sculpture that's had paint put on it, I would think that maybe around the edges it would be a bit frayed. So this is again going back to that kind of like physicality feeling. And then we can also add some like roughness variations over the top, maybe some normal. Now with paint, the best way to get like normal information is probably with texture maps, because paint is like quite a complex thing, but we can kind of ignore that just for the sake of trying to stick with proceduralism today. Okay, so let's go for the edges. I have a node. Let me check my asset browser. Asset library, shader node group tools, get edges. Okay, so I'm going to open this up and show you what's inside of it, but you can download this for free. I have my node group tools package on Gumroad. If I plug this directly into the base color, we'll be able to see what it does, but I need to turn the invert down. Okay. Also, if you want to know where these asset browser buttons come from, they're from my modular workspaces add-on. Shameless plug. All right, so you can see that the get edges node essentially gives us a mask of the edges of the object, and we can invert it as well, so we can get the opposite. So black on white or white on black. What this is useful for is, say, for example, I took a mix node because it's not mix RGB anymore. They changed the node. To be honest, I preferred it as mix RGB because now I have to do two things to get back to the color mixing. I have to make the node and then set it to color, which slows me down a little bit. But if we plug the edges into the factor being like the map essentially. So if you imagine plugging in this white on black map to the factor, it's essentially going to tell the mix node where we can place things. So for example, if I plug that result in, if I make the A black and then the B something like blue, you can see that the factor is essentially guiding this mix node and letting us control where to place the color. So for example, if I replace the black with our original color and put that in here, then you can see that as I change the color of B based on the edge parameters we've given, we can actually change what the edge color is going to be. So this is again kind of introducing more of that kind of physical description of the object into the material. So the question here is, what would we want the color to be? I quite like something maybe a bit darker like that. We can see these little, wavy little speck areas on the hair. I think that's kind of cool. Might be even more cool if we introduce some like bump disruption to it. But anyway, I said I'd show you the nodes for the get edges. So let's take a look here. Let's get rid of that. So getting edges, a little bit complicated. We take the bevel node and then we get the dot product based on the geometry. Okay, you can copy these nodes down if you like. And of course, I've set this up as a node group. So we have a couple of inputs, the radius and the invert. If I started modifying these values, you'd be able to see kind of like how they change the result. So I've got a couple of like personal preference values, like the control radius here. The actual radius value just multiplies it, so that allows us to kind of increase or decrease. Like I said, I've set this kind of like a personal preference value, but you can go higher or lower. It essentially gives me the boundary for like how far from the edge I want to get. So if you were to set up your own get edges node, you might change some of these values, make it just how you like it, but this is how I've got it for now. But again, like I said, you can download it from the node group tools pack on Gumroad. So okay, we have some edges. We're kind of like introducing a bit of blue there. I like seeing how it grows around the hair a bit, but I also like the idea of making this a bit less consistent. So let's go back to just looking at the edge mask. How can we jazz this up a bit? So let's zoom in and focus on one of the more consistent edges, because this will make it easier for us to visualize. So maybe let me take like a noise texture, and I'm going to take a texture coordinate node. The texture coordinate node is important when we're taking these generated randomized textures, because this essentially is what allows us to make it appropriate for any object. If we take the object vector output for the texture coordinate and put it into the noise texture, and then maybe plug the color into the base color, you can see that we get the pattern, the noise pattern. And even though this object is not UV mapped, we can see that it wraps around the object fine. Now I said the object isn't UV mapped. It actually is, because it's a 3D scan and it had textures. But if I plug in the UV, you can see that we have these seam lines here where the different islands are, and it's not really like compatible. You can also use the generated texture coordinate, but you can see that it's a bit stretched here. I always use object for the procedural materials. It works fine. So we're going to stick with that. And also, like, a little tip about shader nodes. If you don't like having all of these loose outputs here, if they're not being used, just have the node selected and press Ctrl H. That will collapse it down. And you can also collapse the node to contain condense that even further. All right, so we have a noise texture. And you can see that it's giving us some random variety. But how are we going to use this data to modify our edge mask? Okay, well, we want to get some black and white harsh randomness that we can cut out of that edge. So maybe let's take a look at the factor. So you have the color, right, which gives you the random color. You also have the factor, which just gives you black and white. We don't need the color, so we'll use the factor. And then let me make a ramp again. You could use a map range instead of a ramp. I hate map ranges because I'm like a very visually focused guy and I like easy artistic control. So what the color ramp allows us to do is kind of like cut down these values or almost clamp them like this. And we have different easing methods available. So if you go to like constant instead, then you can get some like harsher cutouts. But you can play around with the different values, B-spline, linear, cardinal. So you can get a vibe for what might be more appropriate for like the kind of material you're going for. And then modifying the generated noise texture parameters, we can kind of like get different results, like different levels of distortion, maybe extra detail there. We think, okay, if we're cutting out like a kind of painty effect, maybe we'll do something a slightly splotchy like that with some slight distortion. Hey, look, it's kind of like a cow shader. Moo. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to try and combine this data with our edge mask. So remember, we want to try and slice some parts out of the edge. Let me just move these nodes a bit to make it a bit clearer. So let me take the mix node again, set it to color. You could probably do this with a math node as well, but I just tend to stick with the mix colors. So what we're going to do is probably subtract this, I'd imagine. Sometimes I get this wrong with the addition and subtraction because it depends on whether you're cutting like white from black or doing black from white or whatever. But if I plug the edges in as our first value and our cowy noise texture as our second value, and then plug those in to start with, it's gonna mix between them because we got the mix mode set to mix. So we're either gonna have one or the other, right? But if we change the mix node to something like subtract, here we go, that was the right choice. Now we are cutting the cow texture out of the edges. So we can go back and forth and control the intensity of that. So it doesn't have to be completely cut out. You can always leave a little bit, but that's how it looks. Then again, you can adjust the scale if you want to give that like a kind of higher frequency cutoff. Again, you can change the easing mode if you want to make that a bit of like a more smoother cut transition to kind of blur it out a bit. So what I might do is I might set it back to ease, but turn the factor all the way up so we still get some like blurring off there on the edges. So now we've complexified our edge mask. Let's now plug this in as the factor for our color mix and then plug that back in. And then you can see along the edges, you know, have some more variety with the blue there kind of scattering. And we can always go back and modify like the radius of the edges to let that grow out a bit more. So now you have some more kind of procedurally values to give you more control over like that kind of disruption on the edge. Okay, so for the sake of keeping things nice and organized, we can make a frame here. And I'm gonna like select all of these things, drag it into the frame and press N to bring up the side panel, name this edge mask. Now, you know, the cool thing about the modularity of node groups is that we could technically package all of these into a new node group, right? And then this could be our new kind of like paint mask. Paint edge mask, and then you could recycle that for other materials. But we're not going to do that for now. But I just love the shader system, the shader node system, because we can have layers and layers and layers of complexity and then go back into them, improve them over time. So for example, if I did make this into like a paint edge mask node group and I use that for other materials, then maybe one day I want to go and improve that paint edge effect, and it will also improve every other material that uses it. That's the power of modularity with procedural node systems. Okay, so maybe let's try and do that like kind of extra pink splattery thing we were talking about now that we've got some edge variation there. Maybe I'll increase the edge radius a bit as well. So we're getting something a bit abstract, you know. So to do this, we're going to need to recycle the highest pink color. So let's make an RGB node. And if we hover over the color value here, press E, and it'll bring up the eyedropper picker tool. And then because I have this handle selected, we can take it right from the color bar there, or you can press the small square box on the handle because it's the same color, and that will give us the color inside of the RGB. So now we can basically recycle this color like anywhere we like, you know. I could make it the color of the edge mask there as well, so we get like the extra splats. That might also be a good thing to do as well, because it's giving us that splat effect that we kind of want, but along the edges. So again, personal choice, personal preference, do whatever you like. Now, talking about the modularity of like generated textures, maybe I will press the asset browser button from my modular workspaces add-on again, and maybe I will go to my shader node groups again and grab a node group I've already created for getting like splotchy generated effects. I believe this one will be from my procedural patterns pack, which is a paid one because they're slightly more complex node groups, and I can drag my imperfection splotch node group in. So this is where the asset browser is so powerful in Blender. If you haven't used it before, I highly recommend it, especially if you're going to be doing like modular modular type work like this. If you do make a node group, the way you can mark it as an asset for your asset browser is to hover over the node tree name here, right click, and then you can mark it as an asset there. It's a bit confusing because you would expect to right click on the actual node and mark it as an asset, but that's not how it works. Alternatively, if you go up to your outliner, let me expand this, and then change it to the Blender file mode, then under node groups, you'll be able to find the node group you've created. In this case, it'll be imperfection splotch, right click it there, and then mark as asset. So there are a couple of ways you can do it. Okay, but anyway, let me close that browser. So let's take a look at what imperfection splotch gives us. Let me plug the mask into the base color, and the scale is a bit off to start with. That's because we need to grab the texture coordinate again. Now we could just drag the object vector output from the node that we've already created before, but I like to kind of keep things self-contained. So we're going to make another texture coordinate node. I mistyped that. Woo, professional. All right, texture coordinate. Plug the object into the vector. Let's press Ctrl H on that and collapse it again. Okay, nice. But we'll notice the scale is a bit off, so let's reduce the scale. And you can kind of see that we're getting that splotchy effect going. So again, this is another mask that we're creating. Now, we need to find a way to mix the color with the splotch. So we're going to make these splotches pink. But first of all, let me just see what happens if we add a color ramp. Okay, would I be able to... because we could like get kind of complex again. If I start you off as black, sorry, this is where we're just improving a bit, and then blue, and then pink. Okay, so if we wanted to, instead of making the splotches just pink, we can complexify it by again using a ramp instead and kind of adding different layers of color. We'll do one thing at a time. We'll do normal color first. So let's do a mix node. Color. There are actually a few ways you can do this, but let's plug the mask into both the factor and A, and then the color into B, and then plug the result. So what's happening is we're taking the white on black color and the pink color, and we're also using the white on black as a mask. So it says it's only going to put the color where the mask is present. The thing is, we're also going to be getting like these kind of gradient white off bits. We could change the mode to color and like unplug the mask. And then this is another way of doing it where it's going to take the color of the pink and then try and recolor the white from the A. But the thing is, this doesn't really let us get like any darkness in there. We could also multiply, right? So multiplying it by the color, we can add the color, but that also adds brightness. So basically there are loads of different like mixing methods we can use to like, you know, add the color. But I kind of want to go with the mix mode, right? Because I kind of like the idea of having this faded edge a bit. And now we just need to find a way of combining our original color with this kind of painty splotch thing with this effect we've just created. And we could also add some extra complexity by telling it to only appear in the lower cavity areas. To do that, we will need to reuse the ambient occlusion node. But let's just try and mix them basically to start with. Okay, so obviously we're going to take our original color, and then we're going to want to take our new pattern, and let's just plug that in to have a look to start with, right? So we can factor between them, the original and the new one. So one thing we could do, of course, is reuse the mask from the splotch. So we can say that we only want to add it where the mask is present. Okay, look, that works. That's perfectly fine. And if you like it, you can also kind of think about that as like kind of dirty bacterial, maybe like water damage or something where you've got the edges. And we could always like null this down a bit. We could add a math node after the mask and then kind of multiply it by 0 point something, and that would kind of reduce the intensity of it. We can modify the scale because it's a procedural node and change it that way. But I kind of want to try doing the thing I mentioned about restricting it to the lower cavity areas. So to do that, I'm going to have to reuse the ambient occlusion. Now I can tell that this is already getting a little bit scatterbrained in the nodes. So let me just tidy this up a little bit, just a bit. I'm going to make a new frame, and I'm going to put that in there. Name this Splotch. Now again, this is improv, just to remind you. I know that like a lot of tutorial bakers say that sometimes, but they've pre-prepared it. I was never intending to make a paint effect, and I wasn't actually intending to use a node from one of my paid packs, so I might have to make this demo file paid, maybe like $1 or something. Sorry. Damn it, this is a problem of like promising something to people and then it actually gaining value. All right, so let's restrict it to the cavity, see how that works. So first of all, we'll need to grab a new mask because we're going to want the internal cavity. Let's plug the AO into a color ramp, plug it into the base color so we can kind of see what we're doing. We're going to swap the color ramp values around because now we want the white to be the lower cavity areas like this. So just the areas where occlusion is occurring. We want it to be white on black because white is going to tell us where to place stuff. Think about white being a 1 value saying, yes, Boolean true, put it here. So we have the mask. It would kind of make more sense to put the mask underneath because it's closer to the splotch tree. Okay, so this is our combined. Let's plug the color into the factor. No, that doesn't work. What have I done? Let me visualize. Oh, I see, because there's black value there. So I need to visually see what I'm doing with the mix nodes to be able to make this work properly. So just give me a minute to figure that out. Okay, color, white on black. Mask is here. Let's do something with the mask before we plug into the mix. So we take the mask. Again, I don't know if this is correct what I'm doing, so I'm just figuring it out before I show you. Plug the mask there, add the color, subtract, do the opposite. Or would it be add there? Not quite. Use that as the factor. There we go. No, that's not right because we want black. So let's make that black. That's right. Okay. So that's the part of the tutorials that tutorial creators don't always show you. Messing around with the mix nodes just to get it right. Okay, so what's happening here? We have our splotch mask. We want to restrict it to only where the low AO cavity areas are. We have created an AO mask to describe that, the white areas. What we're doing is we're taking a black color because we're building a new mask with this node, right? So we're starting off with black. We just want to add white to it. We're now telling this node we only want to add white to the low AO areas. Okay, so that's why the AO is our new factor. So we're starting with black, but what's the white we're going to add to these AO areas? Well, of course, it's our splotch mask. So that's why it's B. So we plug this into the base color. So we're starting with black. We're adding white, our splotch mask, only to the areas of the AO we've extracted. So that's why that's the factor. So now this becomes our factor mask. We plug that in here, and it's wrong. Okay, but why is it wrong? We can fix this. It's because the color. I mean, it actually looks pretty cool, but it's wrong because that needs to be our factor. There we go. You see, what happened was, because we created a new mask, right, we needed to replace where the splotch mask was being used, but I was still using it for the factor here, so I just needed to replace it with our newer version of the mask. So now, the pink splotches are only being applied to the lower AO zones. This was not as smooth as I wanted it to be, okay? I like doing tutorials in a way where I can easily explain things bit by bit and get it right, like every step of the way. Now we've ended up with something that was confusingly explained and a bit noodly, but that's what improv is like. So let me rearrange this so I can actually kind of show you what that did properly. And you know what? Let's simplify this by making another ambient occlusion mode and keeping these self-contained. I'm going to make a new frame up here, base color. So I'm just rearranging things. This might be confusing if you've just skipped through the video. Okay, moving you here, ambient occlusion. All right, so we rearrange this a bit. Let's do a quick run through of the splotch again because I didn't like how I explained it. We have our texture coordinate with the object vector telling our splotch pattern how to wrap around the object. Okay, so it's wrapping around quite perfectly, but we didn't want that effect to be present around the entire object. So we took the ambient occlusion, made a new mask from it, and the mask looks like this. The mask is white on black, with the white telling us where we want to place the effect. So what we needed to do was make a new mask combining this information. This is why we had the mix node, color mode, add blend mode, and plugging that in, what it does is combine the occlusion data with the splotch effect. Then now that we have the more complex mask, where the splotch is only present on the crevices, we use that mask wherever it's needed. So for example, we can mix the mask with the color pink, like we've got here. We can also use it to say that we want the pink mixed with the base color. Let's plug that in, and we end up with the result. Okay, nice. So we've got something a bit painty. Okay, I did say you could also use a color ramp instead of the pink. I think that might complexify things a bit too much now. I'm not actually sure that would work, or whether it would just be present on the center value. You can play around with that, but I'm going to leave it on the pink for now, just so I don't start confusing myself. Okay, so now we've got splotches in the center. Let's do some roughness variation, because we've just been playing with color so far, the base color. But is there anything we can recycle for the roughness? So remember, the roughness is like your reflectivity, and it'd be nice to get some variation based on what we've already been using. So do we have any interesting masks we can use for the roughness? Sometimes when I want to like change the roughness values, I try just recycle what I already have. So maybe if I took the imperfection splotch and then plug that straight into the roughness, we already get something roughly interesting, pardon the pun. Not necessarily great, but it's like a start you can work with and then like remodify. What about the final mask result? Now let's start with the splotch. Now let me plug it through another color ramp. So splotch into ramp, and we can still visualize this in the color, right, to see what's going on. Maybe I want to add something to this as well. So let me add a math node, put it beforehand. So we're kind of like adding more white to the splotch mask, and then maybe we can like clamp this down a bit, change the values. Roughness, you kind of want it to be more present around the object, so more whites in here. So maybe I'll like raise the black value so we are like getting white, and you can kind of imagine this maybe like a kind of like fingerprinty pattern. Okay, maybe I want to have more control over that. So what if I actually just copy the splotch mask so we can like change the scale manually by ourselves, so we can modify it like that. So if we do something a bit wider, maybe a bit more detail to randomize it a bit, and if I have nothing applied, let me plug that into the roughness. Okay, now because I've got denoising active, right, in my cycle's render settings, it might be a bit difficult to like properly visualize this. So let me make the values a bit stronger. I'm going to darken the white a bit, increase the scale slightly. Okay, I don't really like how sharp the edges are in this, but maybe that's actually appropriate for paint. If I increase the lacunarity on this group. That will give us some like higher frequency detail. God, let me see. Maybe I should keep those kind of harsh lines in there. So maybe I will avoid playing with the node group too much. Let's plug you into the roughness, take a look. So we have some like higher frequency areas of like, you know, reflection to null reflection. And we've got some lines, which maybe that could be kind of representative of a bit of a painterly pattern. So that's in our roughness, and we plug our color in. Now I think the roughness kind of disrupts the surface too much. What we can do, if we're happy with the mask, we can add a final math node, right? And kind of have this as our multiplier. Alternatively, you can just like add or subtract white value from the mask. So if you want to dull it out, you can actually just like slightly add a bit more value, but I would just recommend doing it directly from the mask that we're creating. So let me add a bit more white. Actually, I'm noticing that the values are clamping because I've got this add node here, and you can see that happening where the mask kind of like clamps out at a certain value, then we get these islands. Let me try doing it without the mask so it's not clamping, because you can imagine that if we forced a value more than 1, then the roughness will clamp out because it can only represent, you know, certain values. That might be what's happening here. Okay, I've just done a bit of playing around, and I noticed that the denoiser was kind of messing with our interpretation of the model, because as you can see with the denoising active, let me just turn on the noise threshold. Notice how the visual changes. I don't know if you can see this. As we're going like below and above certain values, it becomes like really foggy and then more detailed. But if we disable the denoising, it doesn't matter where we're going on that value, it's still accurately represented. Now, I don't always use denoising when making procedural materials, but I have had people ask me before why I don't always use denoising. And the reason is because of things like this. It can mess with your perspective. So I have a pattern that I like. The values might have changed since I did like the cut in the video, but the mask generally looks like this. We have splotch areas, and we have some kind of scratchy areas. I pass it through a math node set to multiply, and what this lets us do is it lets us adjust the reflectivity of that mask. So the lower I go, the more reflective, the higher I go, the more muted it is. But you can still kind of see the pattern there. So this lets us control how much that reflectivity is essentially, you know, picking up the light and letting it reflect off the object. So just using the roughness alone actually looks kind of cool, right? Because roughness does a lot for materials. So we're going to keep it at that value, I think. That's pretty cool. Plug the base color back in. So now we actually have a kind of like painterly material with some roughness variation around the object. It's kind of hard to see because, you know, with such complex color going on, you're not necessarily going to notice all of that variation, but if you did a final render, you probably would. Let me just render out an image quickly. Okay, so I've done a quick render, and if you have a look, you can kind of see here where the roughness changes. And sure, if you wanted to be more realistic, we would also feed in the mask where the original paint splotches are, so it kind of matches up with that roughness. We could do that. I think it's kind of nice having some other variation here that you can see. Maybe if I do zoom in on the edge here, we can try and like add the original mask. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to mix our roughness mask with the original splotches so that they better represent the paint that's on the object. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to take that mask, I'm going to add a mix node again, set that to color. So we're going to put our roughness into A, bring the original splotch into B. I'm going to set it to, well, let's take a look at the result to start with so we can mix between them. And I'm going to put it on lighten, all right? So now we're going to take those white areas and it's going to lighten our roughness mask, and you can see where they're appearing there. Then this will become our roughness output, which means that if I scrub the factor back and then forth, you can see where those original paint splotches are. And if I plug the color back in, they're present. So now, technically, the colored paint splotch areas have become higher roughness, meaning they're not as reflective. Now, just out of interest, if we wanted to add some like bump detail, let's make a bump node. I'm going to plug this into the normal. What would happen if we took our roughness mask and plugged that into the height? Technically, we can start to see that there's elevation data here. Ooh, interesting. Let's zoom into that. So we're kind of seeing like some 3D-ness to the paint splotches. Now we can always like drag the strength back on that and control how much the light's affected by it. But sometimes that's enough as like a quick cheat, you know, just plugging in your pre-existing masks and adjusting the strength value until you get something that kind of feels right, where it still feels like there's some like kind of physical layering on the object. But you know, maybe that feels too lazy, but I do feel like it's quite a good idea recycling masks to some degree to, you know, bring new data into it. So instead of using the complete roughness mask, I'm just going to use the splotch mask. And that gives us, as you can see, some of these like high and low lighting areas, which make the surface look a bit more physical. I don't usually spend a lot of time with the bump and normal information, but you are welcome to. All right, so at a point like this, it's quite fun just to like readjust colors and see what happens. So let me take like the highest color value in our base color ramp and mix this around. So blue, yeah, it looks kind of cool. That would actually be kind of cool for like a sculpture. I do like how the bump is affecting the head, but if I save this actually on the pink value, let's try and do something a bit more realistic, I suppose. Let me go for kind of more terracotta-y colors. Can allow some of that blue in, but maybe let's darken it out a bit. So just allow me a moment to do some improv-y stuff. All right, I wanted to try something a bit different. So it's a bit kind of pastel-y. I've increased the bump a bit, so it kind of feels like someone has tried to paint a terracotta sculpture. So it's not like an actual terracotta material. It's a bit too bright orangey for that. We could dull that down like manually. But I like the idea of this kind of being like a kind of imitation thing, and how interesting this would be applied to different objects as well. So what we've got is an interesting hybrid material where, you know, we have something that can be very painterly if we keep the colors being like very varied, multicolored. We've got the kind of splotchy effect, like there's a historical leftover of the creation process behind this. And it's something that if we adjust the values, we could actually bring some slight more realism into it. Okay, so I've added the material to a sphere here. It's trying to react to the shape a bit. I think it's interesting seeing what the effect actually looks like on a sphere, because it kind of gives you a better idea for like the surface look, the imperfections, the bump details, etc. And we can see that actually looks pretty cool. The reason why we've got this gradient is because it's reacting to the shape of the sculpture, because we're using the ambient occlusion data. But if I take like these little cubes down here, like these almost tile-like bricks, and we settle them down into a shape somewhere, they should look quite natural and mixed in with the rest of the scene. I think it's a kind of cool material. Yeah, it's very like hybridized. I might reduce the edge mask a bit because I'm not liking like how dirty it is around the face there. Let's make that a bit more subtle. Yeah, that's kind of cool. I like the orange on it. I don't use orange as much, you know, in my work, so I quite like the result. Definitely seems like something someone would have in an art studio. So what do you think? Maybe I will throw this into like the new pack I was working on as well. But of course I made you a promise. I said I'd put it on Gumroad for you to download. Again, I have used a premium node group in this, so I might have to put it up for $1 or a couple of dollars. But if you found it useful, then, you know, consider leaving a bit of a donation as well, because I do rely on product sales to keep afloat and Patreon support, so that's available if you want to help support my work. So hopefully this incoherent improvisation has like given you some tips, I suppose, or maybe inspired you into a certain direction with creating some of your own procedural materials. This has given me something to play with, and if you made it this far through the video, consider putting like a paintbrush emoji in the comments, because that will help me to see who did actually make it this far through the video. It's probably going to be a longer one again. I recognize a lot of you in the comments. If you don't know how to write emojis on Windows, press the Windows key and the period key, and that will bring up an emoji keyboard. Anyway, hopefully you found this interesting. More content will be coming soon. Remember, I'll put the download link in the description. So yeah, have a great day everyone, and I'll see you next time.